You're now live.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll restart again. Good evening, everyone. Welcome.
I think that dreadful sound means we lost the mayor again, Kirsty.
I'm just wondering whether it would be appropriate for the Deputy Mayor to take the chair.
Well, I was going to suggest, Mr. Deputy Mayor, I was going to ask the Mayor, with that problem having presented itself at the very start of the meeting, if with his consent, you're content to pick up whenever he drops out.
That's fine with me, Ian, as long as it's fine with Mr. Mayor. If he reconnects, if we can get him to reconnect to agree to that, if that's okay.
Kirsty, am I hearing him coming back in?
He's back. He's back, Ian. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I understand you're back with us.
Here's he's Ian. Mr. Mayor's muted, I think, and muted, and yeah, but he's on the call.
I have asked him to unmute, so I'm not sure whether he's just having technical difficulties now.
Mr. Mayor, can you hear us at all? Mr. Mayor, with you being on the call, I'm going to assume that you can hear us. You obviously are having some connection problems. So I was going to suggest that Councillor Howard Blagborough step in as Deputy Mayor and as chair of this meeting if you're unable to do so at any point in the call, which...
Yes, I think I'm in now.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, did you hear what I just had to say about?
I did hear, yeah. I'm hoping that we won't have any technical glitches. We'll move on from there.
Agreed.
Yeah.
But are you content, Mr. Mayor, if that was to happen again?
Yes,
that,
if it does happen again, then yes, Howard will be there, I suppose, yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
are we okay to go ahead now then, Kirsty?
Yes, we are, Mr. Mayor.
Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting. It's a follow-on from the 9th of February, and I think everybody should have had the summons. There are a couple of changes that I'm sure Ian will highlight as we start the meeting. And the first item will be that of any apologies. Moving on from there, members are reminded to need to declare any disclosure of pecuniary interest and other interests that they might have in relation to the items included on this summons. To receive mayor's or chief exec's announcements, Robin.
Mr. Mayor.
No, that's not. So yes, sorry, Ian. Did you want to come in?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, we are just dealing with those items that were adjourned.
So shall I go straight on to 11?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
We have got apologies from Councillor Ashley Evans, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, that's noted. Okay, moving on from where we left off on the 9th of February. Item 11, to receive reports from the leader of the council on the work of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority. Councillor Swift.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Obviously, the written report was circulated at the time. That covers activities up until the date of the original date of the meeting. I'm not going to particularly provide any updates since then, because of course they'll be covered in the report to the next council in 2 weeks' time. Perhaps the only thing, just for interest, I'll comment on, I refer in that report to the statement of intent to go ahead with a enhanced bus partnership, which is sort of an essential step that's required in terms of securing government bus support improvement grants. But you'll be aware that the Mayor's long-term ambition, and I think it's one shared by many certainly many Labour councils across West Yorkshire, is that we move towards a system of franchising, the model that's there in London. And it's interesting in that context to see that today the Greater Manchester has successfully seen off a legal challenge to their franchising plans from the bus companies. Hopefully that's a positive sign and means that should West Yorkshire go down that route, we will face rather less challenges and be able to to learn from the lessons of their progress. But other than that, Mr. Mayor, I'll leave any further updates for the report to next meeting, and simply look forward to any questions.
Very well, thank you very much indeed. I have got one indication, Councillor Parsons-House.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As the chair of the Climate, Energy and Environment Committee, Councillor Swift, you'll be well aware in the Combined Authorities Transport Strategy in 2040, one of the key themes is inclusive growth, environment and health, well-being. It states that the aim is to reduce traffic emissions to near zero. If we are really serious about transport decarbonisation plan, and we need to be, let's face it, with the weather changes that we've all experienced recently, and it's not going to get any better, we need to step up the pace. So to decarbonise all modes of transport by 2050, which is what the plan aims to do, then behaviour change is a key component of that process. So do you believe that changing the infrastructure is going to make people want to leave their cars at home? Or how do you intend to encourage behaviour change? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Councillor. That's a pretty broad topic for a quick question and response. And it's really happy to be expanded on, and it might be something that might usefully form an individual report or an update via scrutiny. You'll be aware that the Transport Committee had a report on their approach to decarbonisation, I think at their September meeting, and following some lobbying and discussion with my own committee, I think they're planning to have a further report on that going forward. I mean, in general terms, I think getting the right infrastructure is critical to this. I know that there are questions raised at the moment about, for example, some of the road schemes, but I think also you have to recognise that in parts of Calderdale, I think the A629 is a good example. If we want to have the possibility of having, for example, protected bike lanes, priority bus lanes, actually we have to get more width into the highway because there simply isn't the capacity to do it there. So it's quite complex in a place like Calderdale. I think there are clear evidence from from nationally that infrastructure that makes it safer to cycle, safer to walk, has a direct effect on people's behaviours and does encourage those changes. And I think there's a lot more that can be done there. I think we've seen some of those effects a little bit with the school streets and some of the experiments that were done during COVID, but there is a huge amount more to be done, and I'd be sort of very happy to kind of try and pull together a report on what's happening and what's going forward. Those who are involved with Combined Authority, it might also be interesting to read in that to try and feed into the debate in terms of spending the growth funds over the next 3 years. The biggest single tranche has been committed to the climate change strand, and obviously we'll be looking in the next few weeks about how to prioritise that and where it can have the biggest impact.
Thank you, Councillor Swift. Councillor Lee. Councillor Lee, did you want to speak?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I've got a couple of simple questions and an observation question for the leader, please. First of all, on your new transport role, in your new transport role, are you taking account that in all of the various meetings on the local plan, we've not quite squared the climate change emission reductions with the extra 20,000 or so vehicles which will be coming into Calderdale as a result of the local plan? And I wondered if at Wicker level you've got any comments on that. And the other simple questions were, and I hope for a great answer, You've said that in the bus enhanced partnership, Calderdale is to gain 8 buses. And my question is, are these going to be new buses? And whatever buses they are, will they be electric? Because as we've just heard from the previous questioner, if we're really serious about this, we should start now, and those buses should be electric. And I think they should be new as well. And I don't think we should be accepting continued hand-me-downs from somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. I'm not going to get heavily into the local plan arguments this evening. I think the issue about emissions and the impact of the local plan is being well debated in the inquiry, and it will be interesting to see what the inspector's report has to say. From a West Yorkshire context as a whole, the climate change plan and the carbon emissions reduction pathway takes account of the fact that there is a need for more housing and plans for house building across West Yorkshire. That's a challenge faced at every level. After all, it's worth remembering that the government is committed to 300,000 new homes nationally. Clearly, we need those homes, but we also need to make sure that the transport and links to them can be done in a way that reduces rather than increases carbon overall. In terms of the new buses, Councillor Lee is absolutely right. This specifically does refer to zero emission buses or electric buses. So those 8 will be new electric buses. Obviously, the concern is that without that, as you've indicated, Councillor Lee, there's been a concern in the past that we've seen a drive where the cities tend to get the newer vehicles because they're concerned about emissions, and we don't want to see that simply leading to older and more polluting vehicles being pushed out towards Calderdale and the other districts.
Thank you very much, Councillor Swift. I don't see any further indications from anyone. So I'm moving on to item 12, to receive reports from the leader of the cabinet members on discharge of their roles. Councillor Swift.
Mr. Mayor, just before we come to that, could I just suggest that Head of Legal wanted just to outline the procedures of the meeting.
All right.
Mr.
Okay.
Mayor.
Yes.
Right. Just to be clear on that before we continue further, I think.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just a reminder to all members of the process that was used on the last occasions when we had full council conducted via Zoom. It seemed to work quite well, so that all members who wish to speak, if they could indicate their desire to do so and on the item they wish to speak, using the chat facility rather than raising their hand, as it's easier to keep track of that and there's a record of it. And if there's a vote, well, there will be on the motions on the summons, then if members could physically raise their hands to the screen rather than using the hand function, as it's much easier for the thumbnail pictures to remain stable if members just raise their hands rather than using the electronic hand that's on the system. So those 2 items. And just a reminder as well, although the Labour motion appears on the summons, it was withdrawn at the last meeting. So there is just the Liberal Democrat motion that remains to be debated this evening. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. Right, moving on to item 12, Councillor Swift.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Again, I don't have anything to add to the report as circulated.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Scullion.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Nothing to add to my report.
Thank you. Councillor Fenton Glynn.
Nothing to add to my report.
Thank you. Councillor Wilkinson.
I think it's me actually, but yeah, nothing to add to the report. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Patient.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just very, very briefly, just thought it worth mentioning about the fact that the latest IPCC report has been published and really impresses the need to move faster on this. The window of opportunity is closing rapidly, and I think it's important that we stress anything we're doing in terms of climate mitigation is ramped up further and faster, especially brought into stark relief after the near flooding events of last week. A couple of other quick things to mention. Was really pleased to go down to Todmorden Climate College along with Mayor of West Yorkshire, Tracy Brabin, to see the first tranche of students graduate as part of their National Lottery funded course. And just to say the action planning process in terms of the Climate Change Working Party is moving apace as well. So nothing more to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Patient. Councillor Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of additions to on updates, really. First of all, we had a very successful anti-poverty partnership event last week, which was focused on debt and money advice and support that's on offer across the borough. And we really committed ourselves to trying to strengthen those partnerships because life's going to get tougher for people. The second thing I wanted to mention was that people may be aware that Cabinet has determined that the Horton Street Customer First office is going to reopen later in the summer for face-to-face appointments for people, because we recognise that that's something which a minority of our residents would really much prefer. So that's hopefully going ahead. The other points, a couple of points to make. Northbridge Leisure Centre, as people will be aware, closed on Sunday, and it's being stripped ready for the contractors to start work, and we're really looking forward to that. Also wanted to mention that we'll be talking, I won't say too much because we'll be talking about it in relation to the motion on littering and fly tipping. But just to mention that we're really pleased from our enforcement team that they report that we've actually managed to get several prosecutions through court, including a custodial sentence for Calderdale's most prolific repeat offender, which was good news. Together with a number of other cautions and notices that were issued and so on. And we're beginning to find that we're getting quite a lot of appreciation of the deployment. We recently got some funding through the Community Safety Partnership to increase the existing number of movable fly tipping cameras. And I had a very nice email very recently from a resident who was with a site which had been previously plagued with fly tipping, and expressing his appreciation of that. So hopefully that's going to really improve things. But we'll talk about that. I can talk about that a little bit more when we come to the resolution. And that's all. Happy to take questions. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much indeed. And finally, before I bring people to questions, Councillor Dacre.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just 2 points to make. First, quickly, that members should have had an invitation for the planting of the Platinum Jubilee tree at the Minster this Friday. So if you are intending to go to that and haven't replied to Tilly Chapel, please do so. And secondly, an update on the reference to the council tax rebate that was in my report. This was the rebate provided by government, and although it's connected to the council tax, it's in fact designed to assist with increased energy costs. It's £150 and it's payable to residents in houses in bands A to D, as long as it's not a second home or an empty property. And the payments will be made by they'll be made directly into people's bank accounts if they're already paying by direct debit, and they'll be made after your first payment of council tax has been made. For other people who aren't currently paying by direct debit, then I really would urge people, if possible, to sign up to a direct debit payment scheme before the 1st of April, because that will speed your rebate payment. And arrangements are currently being, or an application process is currently being designed for those people who aren't going to be able to be paid in that way. So there's also a discretionary scheme that you may have heard of, which is for people who don't qualify for the council tax rebate. And that's going to, again, the details of that scheme are not actually yet known yet, and we'll let everybody know as soon as we can. And just further to all of that, we do recognise that it's going to be a very difficult year with inflation, and anybody who is struggling with the council tax payments, please contact the council before things get too problematic. You may be eligible for discounts and reductions, and help can be given perhaps with payment arrangements. And the council is also working proactively with new staff to identify those who they think may be having difficulties, and they'll be getting in touch with those people to see whether any assistance can be offered, or whether they can signpost them to the relevant agencies to help them. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Baker. Ian, can I bring in people who are wanting to ask questions? Ian?
Yes, Mr.
You
Mayor.
can, Mr. Mayor, yes. Sorry, I was struggling to get off mute for some reason.
All right, okay.
Yes.
I
So
think,
there is a list of questions, Mr. Mayor. Have you received that through the
yeah,
WhatsApp? Yeah.
I can see that on my screen as well. I think it's Councillor Baines, the first one. Do I take it?
It is, yes.
Yep. Councillor Baines?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question is regarding the road surfaces in Calderdale, which are an embarrassment. And could the cabinet member responsible please confirm which roads are within the 94.6% that you list as the criteria to be the best council in the north? And does this cover just A and B roads, or which other roads does it cover? I also want to raise the point about white lining, which is virtually non-existent in many places, increasing the risk of accidents and corner cutting at junctions. Too many of the yellow parking restriction lineages is not continuous or does not have the T-bar at the ends, which makes them unenforceable under the Road Traffic Act. What action have you taken to rectify these problems, which I raised at the last council meeting at the end of February? Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Who's picking that up? Councillor Scullion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I will certainly get Councillor Baines a written answer in terms of the question of precisely which roads are covered. I don't immediately know the answer as to whether it's just A and B roads or whether it's the wider road network, and I will include that in my answer. And entirely take his point about white lining and indeed the yellow lines. And currently we're working across the Regeneration and Strategy Directorate and the Public Services Directorate to see whether there's any possibility of making sure that inspection and then blitzing particular areas can actually be done at the same time, saving money. However, I have to say that this year, within this financial year, we had 1.3 million taken out of our highways budget. So we are really working hard to make that money work as hard as we possibly can. But inevitably, some things are going to creak at the seams. But I will get you a full written answer about the question in terms of technically which roads are included in that statistic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Scullion. Councillor Baker.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question was to Councillor Scullion. It's a regeneration question, because your report talks about the town boards. In Calderdale, you know that we've got quite a large number of lower super output areas which fall within the 20% most deprived in the country, if you look at it on the lower super output area. Yet there's a number of those areas which aren't covered by any of the town boards or any of the other regeneration schemes in place. I was looking at it. I think we've got one in Hipholm and Lightcliffe Ward. There's 10 in Park. One is in Ryburn, 2 in Town Ward, and 3 in Whalley Ward. Elsewhere, you've got 4 in Illingworth and Mixon and 6 in Ovenden. But your North Halifax paper recently kind of covered both of those wards. So really, my question is, what plans you're going to bring forward for all of those other areas with a high level of economic deprivation, which are missing out on the levelling up agenda and the kind of ambitious regeneration strategy that the council has?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Baker, for the question. The short answer is that yes, we have put a lot of effort into trying to get external monies to help lift our market towns, and I think we've been fantastically successful in getting that. It isn't always easy, and of course it's now a competitive process, so we are competing against other towns. It was 100 towns, 101, I think, which got the Towns Fund money, for example, and we fought off other councils in order to get that money. I don't feel that's necessarily very just and fair, but I'm very pleased for the people of Calderdale that we were successful in getting that. However, we are very, very well aware of the issues to do with some of the very small areas, super output areas. And indeed, former Councillor Carter used to mention that particular area in Ripponden that you mentioned, I think, at every council meeting, bless her. What we are doing is basically looking at ways in which we can aggregate particular schemes in particular areas. And we look forward to seeing what's going to come out of the Shared Prosperity Fund, which will be, we'll be clearer about the details of that soon, I hope. But we also understand that after the election, there is going to be a levelling up round 2. Now, we have to see what the criteria is for that, but we're very, very determined that those areas outside the town that haven't really had a crack of the whip so far from the government schemes and the criteria for these government schemes, that we will look at creative ways of making sure that there are those areas that don't meet that criteria. We are struggling with some of the Treasury criteria for some of the schemes that exist at the moment because of the size of Calderdale. And let me just mention something very similar, a parallel fund, which is the Brownfield Fund, where the criteria really are very strict. And many Calderdale sites don't actually meet that criteria. And again, we're looking at aggregate and how we can make the case that actually, although Calderdale is a small authority, nonetheless, the need is very great. And we should look on a programme basis rather than a project by project basis. But rest assured that really is in our minds in terms of being ready and having pipeline schemes to make sure that we can take advantage of those new sources of funding as they come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Scullion. Councillor Holsworth, I think you got a statement. Am I right? Councillor Holsworth?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, you're quite right. It is only a statement. It's just a point that the problem with electric buses and hybrid buses is they're very, very expensive. And the way that the bus industry works in the UK is that large authorities, Transport for London, Manchester, pass their buses down the line so that buses in Leeds and then buses in Kirklees, Calderdale get older and older and older. The average life of a bus is 17 years, and that includes a refurbishment of the interior. And the problem is that the cost of supplying Calderdale with brand new buses is so exorbitant. I simply can't see how it could work. The other issue that the UK has is because we have right-hand drive buses, we can't sell our buses on to very many other countries apart from Malta. And in Malta, they can't cope with double deckers. So that's just my concern about how green we're going to be able to be fairly quickly. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Whittaker.
Mr. Mayor, Councillor Scullion wanted to respond on that point on buses.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, come back, Mrs. Councillor Scullion.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted a very quick response. In terms of the provision of the new buses, it's my understanding that, of course, the operators, as they replace their fleet, will be bringing in a number of electric buses in the cities. Now, clearly that's unfair on authorities like Kirklees and Calderdale, where the routes are not quite as lucrative as some of the city centre routes. And therefore, the combined authority have bid into a government fund called the Zebra Fund. I can't remember what it stands for, zero emission buses, something, to make sure that we don't lose out so that we actually get a reasonable share of electric buses. And I'm very hopeful we should actually hear in the next just very few weeks whether we've been successful in that Zebra low emissions bus provision for Calderdale and Kirklees. So let's keep our fingers crossed and really push for the fact, as you say, that we're really not prepared to take old buses that are left over from the other areas. Thank you.
Thank you
very much, Councillor Scullion. Councillor Whitaker.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I believe my question's to Councillor Dacre in relation to the Stonewall Diversity Champion Scheme, from which over 40 public bodies have recently disaffiliated from, including the BBC, the Crown Prosecution Service, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and many government departments. For many reasons, but because of Stonewall's chief executive trivialising of anti-Semitism. Last year, one of the Stonewall's co-founders accused the organisation of becoming cornered into an extremist stance. Can Councillor Dacre therefore explain why the council felt fit to renew their corporate membership with Stonewall? And does she believe that this scheme is a good use of taxpayers' money, given the budget constraints that the administration constantly reminds us of? And secondly, Mr. Mayor, just as a follow-on from that, can Councillor Dacre advise whether an equality impact assessment and consultation has been carried out on the council's decision to change all staff and public toilets, such as those in the borough the borough market in Halifax, to mixed sex? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Dacre.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. In relation to the second part of the question, I will have to provide Councillor Whitaker with a written answer. Public toilets or conveniences are not my area, so I can't answer that question. In relation to Stonewall, this the matter of the subscription to Stonewall has been considered carefully, and the subscription has been renewed for a year, and it will be considered again at the end of that year. What I can say, and again I can write in more detail about this after the meeting, but we have had a lot of useful assistance from Stonewall in relation to staff matters over and how to deal with equality issues over the last few years. They've provided an invaluable service. Whilst when we were looking at the issues that in relation to trans rights, for instance, which was the one that was particularly contentious at the time we were looking at the subscription, we also consulted with our LGBT plus group within the workforce, and it was their view that they very much wanted us to maintain the subscription to Stonewall. And that was obviously quite a strong factor in the decision that we made. So as I say, it will be kept under review, but at the moment, we felt that they were offering useful support to our organisation, and it was a decision that was supported by those within our workforce who you might feel would perhaps feel most strongly about it. In those circumstances, I think it is an appropriate use of public funds, but it will be kept under review, and I will provide a written reply.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dacre. Councillor Dickinson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to offer a challenge to Councillor Patience to give a deadline for the production of the climate change action plan. I read an article recently that he was planning on issuing it after the election, which is fair enough. But in terms of pinning it down to a final date, I was wondering if he'd be willing to accept that challenge.
Councillor Patience.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Dickinson, for your question. I think what's important going forward is that we do it right. And that we don't, and that we don't do it speedily just for the sake of it. Some comments about the action plan levelled against us have mentioned, councils where action plans have been developed rather quickly. In a lot of those cases, they've not necessarily had the right consultation, the right kind of outreach. And often they've not been based in the kind of science that we need to be really sure that ours are based in. So I think what we are looking for is to do the process as described that you're clearly a part of as a member of the Climate Change Working Party at the moment, and then make sure that we speak to our officers internally about that through the Internal Climate Officer Forum, and then actually take what we've come together and take that out to the community so that they have the opportunity to feed in. And that's from environmental groups like Green New Deal to other environmental activists, as well as other people within the public, private sector, as well as the voluntary sector, of course. So I would hope that we get some of the kind of final level of detail within May, and hopefully very, very soon after that, we have something that we can present as a finite action plan for the next 3 years, and then we will revisit it after that. As you'll know, we kind of agreed a 3-year kind of period, and then we'll revisit it after that.
Thank you very much,
yes.
Councillor Patient. Yeah. Any more? No. Councillor Cook. Councillor Cook.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much. Question to Councillor Swift, Councillor Tim Swift. Would you be able to give us an explanation of where the Chief Executive has been since he went on leave? Because all the information that we were given was that he was on leave. We weren't told what leave that was, whether it was sick leave or any other sort of leave.
Mr. Mayor, if I can just interject with Councillor Cook, requesting where chief officers are on leave is a matter of personal information which no one is obliged to give out. The Chief Executive has been on leave. That is enough for this meeting. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hughes. Thank you, Councillor Cook.
Okay, we'll have a second question then, please, Mr. Mayor.
Can we, therefore, can you direct the questions to the portfolio holders, please?
Yeah, certainly. A question for Councillor Patient. Councillor Patient, I brought this up in a previous debate, an emotion that was raised, and it was simply that the council was not working to the right standard, the right international standard for carbon neutrality. And it is a very important issue because it affects the council's whole climate change agenda. And that is the standard is PAS 2060, and I would urge Councillor Patient to look that up. Would you be able to answer whether or not the council started working to that international standard, please?
Thanks, Councillor. Thanks, Councillor Cook. I've no need to look that up. I'm quite familiar with it. Yeah, I feel that at the moment we are working to what we need to. Part of our environmental management and internal audits obviously use a slightly different system, but we are open to the idea of using the system that you mentioned. Some of that will come out within the climate action planning process. We don't know what the end results of that are going to look like at this point. And clearly that's going to be a wide open consultative process, as mentioned earlier. There are pros and cons to that. There's also a lot of other areas where we need to do finer detail in terms of whether we're measuring methane, whether we're looking at aviation and things that are in and out of the borough that we can't necessarily control. So there are things to be fed in and out as part of that process. But I take your point. And thank you for your question. I'll try and get you any further detail on that in a written response, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Councillor Patient, for that. Councillor Amanda Parsons.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Parsons Hall. So it's a mouthful, I know. Okay, I would like to ask a question to Councillor Jenny Lynn, please. In the last few months, we have received numerous complaints about speed, and as I'm sure everybody else here has as well, especially from residents on Moor End Road and Heath Hill Road and the Newlands Road. So again, this kind of looks a bit like a circuit. And we had a serious incident on the corner of Broadley Avenue just a couple of weeks ago, where a couple of young people using nitrous oxide had basically filled the vehicle and then lost control at the corner, ploughed into the wall of one of our residents. You know, it's becoming increasingly worse, shall we say. Can you please tell us, Councillor Lynn, what you intend to do about this situation, how you plan to deal with this dangerous driving, and what you're doing about the use of nitrous oxide? Thank you.
Councillor Lynn.
Thank you, Councillor Parsons-Hulse, for your question. And yes, I'm very happy to answer it. Really in part in my capacity as co-chair of the Community Safety Partnership. The Community Safety Partnership has provided a significant amount of funding in the past and continues to do so to Operation Home Mill, which, as you know, deploys additional traffic police, if you like, who are really deployed right up until I think it's 1 o'clock in the morning. So it's not just something that stops at 5 o'clock, with a view to trying to catch people in the act in terms of the key dangerous driving things. And I know that all members receive notification of some of the outcomes of that. I think that's really important. The other point that I would say, and I think that this is something which all members are able to do, is that we do have the regular meetings of the Safer, Cleaner, Greener groups, into which our wards are grouped. And those take place every 6 to 8 weeks. And of course, one of the things that people are asked to do, members and participating partner organisations, housing and other people who are involved in that, is to advise the police on the 3 top priorities for action going forward over the next 6 or 8 weeks until the next meeting. And I know from my own experience in the grouping that I sit in as a member for Park Ward, that on occasions it's proved really helpful for us to be able to identify particular problem areas where we know that we've got real difficulties, with a view to giving some guidance to. So I would encourage you to do that. I think that the question, and similarly your reference to people driving under the influence of drugs, clearly that is a problem, and in some areas with some pretty horrible consequences. So I would certainly encourage you to use the Safer, Cleaner, Greener. I'm very happy to make sure that that this is an item that we put on the agenda of the next Community Safety Partnership, and I thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lynn. Councillor Izzat.
Hi, my question is to Councillor Lynn, but perhaps I'd just like to make a slight comment on the back of the comments made by Councillor Dacre with regards to the question on Stonewall. Whilst it is entirely appropriate to seek the views of the LGBTQ community when discussing Stonewall, I think it might also be nice if we could communicate and listen to and take into account the views of some other female organisations across the area, as well as so that we get a balanced and broad view of all people's viewpoints on what is quite an important issue. So that was just a comment with regards to the question on Stonewall for when we next make our review. My actual question to Councillor Lynn is regards to the funding that you discuss in your report for tennis courts. There are not many public or council-owned tennis courts left in Calderdale's control, as there are many groups which have taken on a lease. There is 2 tennis courts in Ripponden, which were under the process of trying to go through a community asset transfer, but unfortunately, due to the significant length of time, that has not happened, and now they are in an unplayable state. I am really pleased to read in your report that there is £22 million worth of public funding coming from the government into the refurbishment of these courts, which is supported by the LTA. And the LTA have identified Calderdale as an area that they would like to work with. Can I seek your assurances at this time that the courts in Ripponden will receive some of this funding, as the popular, or as the growing group, I should say, the growing Soiland and Ripponden tennis group are now having to seek facilities at Ryburn School, as the ones in Ripponden are completely unplayable for competitive tennis?
Thank you very much, Councillor Izzat, for raising that point about the courts that were previously used by the Soiland and Ripponden Club. I honestly don't know whether they're included in the bid to the LTA funding, but I shall certainly make inquiries, and we will make sure that you get a written answer to that effect. And I'm really glad to hear that there might be light at the end of the tunnel for that. I used to play tennis myself many years ago, but not any longer. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Councillor Bellinger.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question for Councillor Scullion. But firstly, I'd like to say I fully agree with what Councillor Baines was saying with the white lining and the resurfacing of the roads, the poor conditions, because I have many roads in my ward where we have a lack of both, a lack of white lining and the poor conditions, which can result in potential accidents happening, because obviously white lines direct people to where they need to drive, basically, which moves me on really to my question as well. And that is, I've noticed where we've had road surfacing which has actually taken place, and areas where we've actually had the pavements resurfaced with the tarmac as well, and they're actually failing in a lot of places, and a lot of the pavements are becoming quite treacherous underfoot, not as a trip hazard but more of a slip hazard because of the tarmac failing. And I'm thinking, what are we actually doing as an authority to hold these companies that are sort of like providing this poor workmanship to account for what they're doing? You know, what sort of guarantees are they providing on the lifespan of the surfaces that they're actually putting down? You know, what we're doing to make sure that they come back and repair these, because obviously they've failed within such a short period of time. And then that way, if we get these companies to repair them, it'll prevent us actually paying for, you know, to do them ourselves really as an authority. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Scullion.
Thank you, and thank you to Councillor Bellinger for his question. It is, I know, the Assistant Director, Stephen Lee, an issue that he has been pursuing very actively in terms of the sheer number of openings, of road openings that we have for the utilities in particular every day. And you know that we've got very old infrastructure underneath our roads. People think of just seeing the tarmac surface, and of course there are infrastructure highways for all kinds of things underneath, and we do have a lot of road openings as a result. And certainly Stephen Lee, Mr. Lee has been assiduous with the streetworks team in terms of pursuing the contractors in terms of restoration of that. I think there are two things. The other thing is, of course, the difficult issue of pavement parking and misuse of the pavement, which cracks up those surfaces. And the government have been doing a consultation on pavement parking, and we are looking at the question of what powers we might pull to Calderdale in terms of giving us some authority to be able to enforce and fine people in relation to pavement parking, because I know it's a particular issue in some areas. And you're absolutely right, you know, particularly where there's slabs, not just tarmac, but where there's slabs that then get broken up because of delivery drivers and so on driving on the pavements. I will provide you with a written answer though, because I want to make absolutely sure with Mr. Stephen Lee's help in terms of making sure that we do actually give you the full information that you're asking about. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Scullion. Don't go away, because I think you want to respond on buses. Am I right, Councillor Scullion?
I think I have given an initial response on buses.
So shall I move on from there then?
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My comments relate to consultation and effective communication. So prior to Christmas, the 3 ward councillors went on a site visit with council officers and the Environment Agency in relation to flood alleviation. So it's an important aspect in Brighouse because we're getting more and more water as we're getting more flooding. Unfortunately, they've chosen to conduct their consultation with the general public this evening. So I'm most disappointed about that. So really would like officers to communicate with councillors. I know this is an additional meeting, but it's been called since this meeting was called. So going on from the consultation, I'd like to ask what is the present position in relation to the A641 consultation, and where are we with that? And the final point, Mr. Mayor, is in relation to the subways in Brighouse. I have chased this over a number of years. I have been promised that they will look into taking the tiles off and resurfacing X, Y, and Z. When I've asked for updates, I'm getting blank. I'm getting absolutely nothing. So I would appreciate an update on the subways as well. So thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Blackburn. Is it Councillor Scullion?
It is indeed. I'm really sorry to hear about the clash with the Environment Agency consultation in Brighouse, because we know how important that is. And I think they've been there during the day today as well, actually, in terms of public consultation. I guess when they programmed it that we didn't know that we were having this extra meeting, but I will take that up with them because these consultations we've learned through the Mythenroyd flood alleviation scheme are absolutely crucial, really, in terms of shaping the scheme, in terms of pulling in the local knowledge, just absolutely essential, really. And we need to do more of them, and newsletters and other things as we go through. So I will make absolutely sure that the Environment Agency officers are aware that that was really an unfortunate clash. In terms of the A621 consultation, I will find out the details, but I will do my best to make sure that there aren't the same kind of clashes, because that would be unfortunate. In terms of the subways, I will chase that. I think there is a tension between looking at the road traffic, the pedestrian and the cycling schemes and all the changes around that, and the future of those subways. And clearly they're important at the moment in terms of getting safely underneath the road. What the designs look like in terms of that scheme and what that means for the subways eventually, I think maybe one of the things that's causing the pause or lack of information in relation to that. But I will provide you with a written answer, and I will strongly press the Environment Agency to make sure that the various consultations on the various schemes, I'm thinking of the Hebden Ridge scheme, in which I must declare an interest, of course, the Sorby Bridge early and Copley early schemes, but importantly the Brighouse scheme, which is such a major scheme and so important for the town, really. But I will come back to you on all of these. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Councillor Scullion. I have got one more, Councillor Robert Thornburg.
Right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a question, Councillor Scullion. I know we technically still in winter and summer seems a long way away, but can you confirm that, our grass cutting teams and all the issues such as what we had last?
I think, Councillor Thornburg, the grass cutting teams you need to direct to somebody else.
Oh, I think Councillor Lynn.
Yes.
Right. Sorry about that. But can you confirm the council's highway department are ready for the grass cutting season, so we aren't ending up with the same situation with dangerous junctions we had all over the borough like last year? I think it's one thing we can plan for. I know it's some time off, but it's something we need to ensure we don't have a repeater. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor.
Mr. Mayor, shall I respond?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your question, Councillor Thornburg. And yes, from our Green Spaces and Street Scene team in Public Services, yes, we certainly are gearing up for getting ready for grass cutting where appropriate, and particularly, and you're quite right to say, the important point is to ensure that all our junctions and key roads the visibility is there. I'm not going to reopen the issue about pollinating insects, but I hope that people will bear with us that that there are some areas of grass which will not be cut until after pollination. But yes, there were particular issues which we faced last year that were to do with health and safety matters, and those we have gone beyond those. That's completely sorted out, I hope. But thank you very much for raising it, and also for reminding us that summer's on its way before too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lim. Right, I have got no further indications. Therefore, I shall move on to item 13. Members and substitute members as necessary to serve in scrutiny boards, panels, and council committees. Who is responding to that?
Mr. Mayor,
Councillor Swift.
There was a paper circulated at the last meeting. The only appointment on there was of a co-opted member to the Children and Young People Scrutiny Panel, and I'll move the paper as circulated.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much indeed for that. Item 14, to appoint representatives to serve on outside bodies.
Mr. Mayor, sorry, that needs to be something that the meeting agrees to on item 13.
Yep. Does the members agree to item 13? All in favor? I am not able to count everybody, Ian, because I can't see. I think most of the hands are up at the moment, as I can see.
Yeah, I'll do that for you, Mr. Mayor, if you just bear with me a second, but
Okay.
yes, I think you're right. Yeah, that's carried, Mr. Mayor.
That's carried. Thank you very much indeed. Item 14, appoint representatives on outside bodies. Who is taking that? I think there was a paper on it last time round. I take it.
There was a paper circulated. I can't recall whether it actually had names in it. I think it was something to do with Brick House. I think Councillor.
I think it's to do with the, if I'm not mistaken, Councillor Swift, the Brick House Nurses Endowment Fund, I think.
Mr. Mayor, yes, it was. It was.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, Councillor Blackborough.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. Yes, it was to do with the nomination of 2 representatives to fill the place on the Brick House Nurses Endowment Fund, and it was. The names were published. My apologies. Mr. and Mrs. Ratcliffe actually have agreed to serve on that committee to make up the numbers, so we can then fulfil and hopefully spend the interest of the £190,000 that we can spend in the Brick House areas for people in need. So thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Blackborough. Councillor Swift, is there any comments?
No, that's fine, Mr. Mayor.
Can we accept those nominations? Can I put that to the vote? All in favour? Mr. Hughes, I'm looking at you.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just counted. That's carried.
Thank you very much indeed. So we move on to item 15. Answer questions by members on the council's procedure rule 13. Any questions on 13?
Mr. Mayor, there were no questions submitted under this item.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll move on to item 16. That's item A, motion submitted by Councillor Parsons-Hulls. Have I got a seconder for that?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I'm seconding. I believe Councillor Parsons-Hulls is going to ask leave of council to move the motion as amended by the Labour group.
Before you do that, Councillor Holsworth, did you put your hand up? I can't hear you. You're still
only to second Councillor Parsons-Hulls.
I think Councillor Baker has already done that now.
Yeah,
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah,
that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, Councillor Parsons-Hulls.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I would like to. I'm happy to accept the amendments that Labour have put forward. And I'd just like to begin by thanking all of our officers who work so hard. You know, I've got to say, this is such a difficult job for people. And I really admire those people who go out there and do this job. You know, from the local litter champions, you know, to the fly tipping operatives, to everybody who works behind the scenes, you know, to clean up. You know, it's a massive, massive job. So, yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so litter and fly tipping, we certainly did talk about this in some
Mr. Mayor,
detail.
Sorry, Councillor Hughes.
Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a procedural matter that needs to be dealt with first with the indication that Councillor Parsons-Hulls has given that as mover of the motion, she is prepared to accept the Labour amendment to it. The seconder of Councillor Parsons-Hulls' motion needs to indicate that he or she is also happy to accept the Labour amendment.
Yeah, it was Councillor.
Councillor, if that happens, then Mr. Mayor, you need to put the procedural motion to the meeting to seek consent that the amendment is accepted as the Liberal Democrat motion, without there being any discussion on that, and then return to Councillor Parsons-Hulls for the introduction of her motion.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Hughes. Councillor Baker, you were
yes, I'm happy to second that.
Are you accepting the amendment?
I am. Yes.
Right. Thank you very much. And the move of the Labour amendment, Mr. Hughes.
No, Mr. Mayor, it now needs to be put to the vote, Mr. Mayor, of the meeting to accept the Labour amendment as the Liberal Democrat motion.
Yeah. Okay. All in favour? Have you got that, Mr. Hughes?
Sorry, Mr. Mayor. I need to see members' videos on if they are wanting to vote on this item. Okay, if you ask for all those against, Mr. Mayor.
All against?
That's less than, Mr. Mayor, so that procedural motion is carried and the Liberal Democrat motion as amended by the submitted Labour amendment becomes the substantive motion.
Yes.
It can now be, Councillor Parsons-Hulse can move it, and then you can seek to have comment or a reservation on the matter from the seconder before taking the Conservative amendment.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much for that, Mr. Hughes. Councillor Parsons-Hulse.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So am I allowed to speak to it? Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I mean, as we all discussed last time, you know, it was only a few weeks ago, fly tipping is a major issue that we're all experiencing across the borough. And there were over 3,000 fly tips in Calderdale last year and only 12 offenders. And I'm so pleased to hear from Councillor Lynn that we've caught one of the major culprits. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that information. Anyway, I do not intend to talk at any great length, as I did talk about this at our budget council just a few weeks ago. But I would like to share some of the wins that Newham London Borough Council reduced their fly tipping by 42% from some of these things. So I'm aware that, you know, we do use crime scene tape, which obviously brings high visibility to the fly tips. And it would be great if we can have a very sort of, it's just for 3 days and then we take it down and be very regimented about it so people can see it. It did work in Newham, and, you know, it reduced the fly tipping by 64% with less than 1% displacement to neighbouring streets. That's quite a high result. Also the social, the social impact stencil. So this is where they spray the fly tip with, you know, we know that this has happened and this is how much it's cost to remove it. So you're basically letting people know that this is where our council tax goes. This is how much this costs. It's a huge cost to our borough. So, and again, once again, fly tipping was reduced by an average of 67%. 46% of residents surveyed said that the intervention made them think twice about what they did with their unwanted furniture, and 58% felt that it showed the council was working towards tackling the fly tipping. So it's a way of promoting what you guys are doing, you know. I really, you know, this is really not a motion to put anybody down. You know, I really, what we want to do is support what you're doing and add something to it. You know, love your ward weekends and things, you know. So again, you know, informing the public and gaining their support is an important route to staying on top of this situation. You know, there are many things to consider when we talk about our waste or fly tipping and environmental vandalism, full stop. You know, working towards that large scale reduction in fly tipping reduces the number of vehicles and associated emissions as well. So, you know, there's also an environmental benefit to be had there as well. And furthermore, recycling increased where residents did manage to manage their waste better through the appropriate channels. So yeah, I would call on our members this evening here to support this motion, and you know, and I do support the amendment that we've had, and thank everybody who worked so hard in Calderdale to face this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Baker, would you want to come back?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be pretty quick, but this is, I mean, councillors, you know what this problem is. I mean, you've seen it in all your wards, and some of you might think, oh, these Lib Dems are always going on about it, but partly because I think, you know, there is a lot of it around Pelham. There are certain hot spots, and we represent part of that area, which is particularly badly affected by this. So we're really just trying to, do our job and stand up on behalf of residents and try and keep going on about this as much as possible and try and get as much action on it. But there's a really good best practice out there across the sector. We've come up with some good ideas on scrutiny. There have been some good improvements in recent years, like the online fly tipping map, I think is a real step forward. And we're just fully behind that and just trying to see what we could do to get even more of that pace of change and get things done. Thanks. Thank
you very much indeed, Councillor Baker. Mr. Hughes, do I bring in the Conservative motion in next?
You do, Mr. Mayor, yes.
Yeah, and is that Councillor Lee? Who's proposing?
Yes, it's me. Thank you,
yeah.
Mr. Mayor. Okay, thank you. Yes, we do have an amendment to this motion, but I must say, before introducing it completely, that we totally agree with the sentiment surrounding this issue. Fly tipping is a blight on the whole of the borough, and as Councillor Parsons-Hults has just said, there are very many issues to be dealt with. And we consider that this would be best dealt with by a properly organised scrutiny group, probably place scrutiny, where we can have robust and full cross-party debate about this subject. In my ward, in Ryburn ward, any of you that have travelled in and out of the borough using junction 22 will know that the incidence of fly tipping along that road from the motorway down is absolutely terrible. And, that's one of the conduits into our borough, and it sends out all the wrong messages. I know that you can argue that conduits into any borough around the country could reflect that too, but it really is terrible. And we definitely want to do something about it as a party. Indeed, in our budget, we wanted in our spending plans to increase expenditure on enforcement. But that's not the only answer either. There are many ideas, as have been outlined by the Liberal motion and the Labour amendments. But I don't think it's apposite to just agree on this evening and not have a more comprehensive discussion. There's 51 councillors, and we really need to nail this. It's true that, as Councillor Parsons-Hults has said, the incidence has risen to around 3,000 last year, from historically about 50, 40, 50 each year for the preceding years. It's sort of just exponential. And this isn't anybody's particular fault, but during lockdown, there were closures of the waste disposal facilities, which coincided with this very high, sudden popularity, if that's the right word, for this terrible fly tipping scourge. And that is, it's increased by a factor of over 100 times. But unfortunately, the incidence of prosecutions, as we heard from Councillor Lynn, I think earlier on, are still only very small. And compared with 3,000 incidents, it's way below 1%. And that's why in our budget, we wanted to do something about strengthening the enforcement teams. So we do really genuinely believe that there's a lot of good in these motions. We do want to support the concept, absolutely. Every councillor on this council is blighted by it. It's horrible, it's terrible, but we urge everyone present this evening to just respond, hopefully, to our amendment, was that we look at it thoroughly rather than deal with it summarily this evening with a couple of motions, well-intentioned though they are. So I would like to move our motion that we should refer the resolutions stated on the original and the modified motion this evening to the relevant scrutiny panel to consider further and report back to Cabinet in due course. Due course being that this is something that I'm sure we all view as a very urgent issue as well. So I do move our motion and ask every member to consider the position and support the motion. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Who's your seconder? Is that Councillor
It's Councillor Baines.
Councillor Baines, are you the seconder?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. I beg to second this and reserve the right to speak.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Mr. Hughes, where is it back to the original motion then?
No, Mr. Mayor, it's Councillor Barnes who wishes to speak to the amendment.
Yes, Councillor Barnes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's very interesting that the Conservatives are proposing that rather than 51 councillors discuss this issue, that it's actually sent to a committee where a small group of councillors look at it, which to me is not very democratic. So in that, regardless of the other point on that principle, I will be voting against their motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Is there anybody else? Councillor Fenton Glynn.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of echo Councillor Barnes's point. I also don't think that this motion precludes us having continued conversations about fly tipping and the best way to deal with it. I really welcome the support for what Newham Council have done. Obviously, 60 out of 60 councillors in Newham are Labour, so often Labour do have the best ideas, but I'm not necessarily prepared to believe that we have all the best ideas on this. I think an open debate is helpful, but we're different than Newham as well. And, you know, we're rural, they're central London. In fact, it may be difficult to find two more different boroughs, but I think it's one of those, like, if we've got 100 different ideas, it's better. I sat on Place Scrutiny Board and Economy and Environment before that for a lot of my time on the council, and we did discuss this issue a number of times. The issue is we've got a rise in the amount of fly tipping that we're getting nationally, and we are also being hit by that. And I think that's one of the reasons I want to see us continue to have this discussion, but also support the motion in the form that it's being proposed tonight.
Thank you very much, Councillor Glynn. Councillor Bellinger.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I understand where Councillor Lee's coming from, and I've seen it too, where the litter is really bad on the borders between Kirklees and Calderdale and up towards the M62. And I think this is something that we can certainly work on with the volunteers that we're actually working with now. And it's great to see that, I don't usually like mentioning officers' names, but Amy now becoming full-time, who deals with the volunteering section within Calderdale. There's some fantastic work taking place there, and we can see it throughout the ward, and it's bringing people together as communities as well. And, you know, and they take a little bit of ownership then of the places in which they live in, and they respect the areas a little bit more because they've had that input into making it different, making it better. So I really support what Labour have done tonight with their amendment and supporting our motion as well with their amendment. So I really appreciate that. And there's some really good work taking place, and we are moving forward. We certainly are moving forward. Yes, we've still got issues with fly tipping. And I did some work on fly tipping a few years back, and I think there were about 1,200 incidents throughout the year, which equated to about £172,000 a year that it costed us as an authority to remove all that fly tipping. But I think we need to also look at how we can reduce that by making it easier for people to dispose of possibly building materials at household waste centres. These are people, residential people that are doing work to their own properties that are having difficulty to dispose of it there because it's classed as trade waste, and these people are actually not tradespeople. So there's little things there that I think we need to tweak to make it easier and possibly prevent that fly tipping. But at the end of the day, I totally welcome what Labour have done with this, and I certainly, unfortunately, can't support the Conservatives' amendment, but ours, I certainly do. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bellinger. Councillor Fazal. Councillor Fazal.
I think one thing that we've got to understand is that we have to talk to the residents and educate the residents and make sure that people start taking pride in their neighborhoods. I remember a time when everyone took pride in their neighborhoods. And for example, in front of your house, you clean that area, and every neighbor did the same. And I think it's just highlighting this to the residents and making sure that people take this on board. And that's through education in schools, nurseries, and at home and other institutions. And we as councillors, and I know that a lot of our councillors do, which is do cleanups in our neighborhoods. We and Councillor Faisal a few days back did a cleanup around a masjid in Gibbet Street, for example. And that helps in terms of educating the public and making sure that we make Calderdale a beautiful place that it is to live and take pride in. But I'm against the Conservative motion because I entirely agree with Councillor Barnes that 51 councillors here in this meeting, we are able to debate and express our views. And I think we've done that. So I'm against the Conservative motion.
Thank you very much, Councillor Faisal. Councillor Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wish to speak on the amendment tonight. As chair of the Adults Scrutiny Panel, I actually carried out a very comprehensive review of the pandemic, including a number of experts from different fields. The advantage of discussing this in a scrutiny environment means actually you can bring other people from outside, the experts that are actually managing with this. So actually, I really do think it's a great idea. We all agree. Absolutely, everyone on this panel agrees that actually is one of the most issues we get in every single award, and it is absolutely appalling. You know, people shouldn't be doing it. We shouldn't have to tackle this. People should take pride in where they actually live. But unfortunately, we do come across people that don't. They don't care. But I do really feel that actually we could bring in some experts that have some wonderful advice as well. So that's why I would be supporting the amendment this evening. That really do want to tackle the issue of fly tipping. Full stop. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. Do I go back to the amendment again, Mr. Hughes?
Mr. Mayor, you have Councillor Baker first.
Oh, sorry. Oh yes, I have. Yeah, Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I just want to make a point. On the 3rd of June 2021, the Place Scrutiny Panels discussed litter and fly tipping in rural areas, had on its work plan in 2018-19. 3rd of October 2019, it was discussed by the Place Scrutiny Board. 7th of February, it was discussed by Place. 2017, Councillor Caffrey and Councillor Scullion and myself took part in a detailed scrutiny review of that environment scrutiny panel on the topic of fly tipping. The points I want to make are, it has been, in my opinion, discussed quite thoroughly at scrutiny in detail over a number of years. We've also got some really good sector-wide examples of best practice. As Councillor Fenton Glynn points out, happens to be a Labour councillor that done it down there in Newham. But, you know, there's other examples of best practice. I think now's probably the time for the Cabinet to, after we've come out of COVID, you know, the community protection teams have got a bit more time. Some of that improvement was delayed by COVID impact on us. Now I think it's the time to look at this again, see what else we can tweak in our policies to improve things. There's nothing to stop. I mean, the Conservatives already have chair of Place. There's nothing to stop them putting it on the agenda again. It doesn't need what I consider a bit of a wrecking amendment to put it on that Place scrutiny. You can do that already as a political group if you want to discuss it again. Maybe, you know, after Cabinet have come up with some things and there's an actual paper in front of us at that point, we could scrutinise the actual details of it rather than just having another vague overview at scrutiny. So I guess what I'd urge council to do is vote for some action tonight rather than just kicking it into like the scrutiny long grass.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Councillor Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've listened to the debate to date, and I certainly agree with everything that Howard Blackburn has just talked about. I think, you know, our officers, I think, do a good job. Certainly in North Arran and Shelf, Mark, who's the team leader, and his staff do an excellent job of cleaning up as soon as possible when he's notified of any fly tipping, etc. But we do not bring enough prosecutions. And once we get prosecutions like the one that's mentioned earlier about somebody as being caught and sentenced, That is a rarity. We usually get nowhere near the number of prosecutions that we should have if we are going to deter people from this. And it's adverse publicity will not do us any good. It's got to be some hard penalties for these people who are blind, ruining our safer and greener areas. And that's just not in parks, etc. It's the whole of the, we get them dropped on the side of side roads up in Shelf and North Arham. So this is what we ought to be doing, and taking a much harder line, which I've been saying this for years, and nobody ever takes it on board and go out for more prosecutions. And it's what we've talked about in this resolution tonight. It's just a handful, a small, very small minority of the actual cases which come to any form of prosecution, and it's just not good enough. Thank you,
Councillor Rains. Councillor Foster. Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, just a short comment, really. I was down to second our original amendment, which obviously I haven't needed to do because Councillor Parsons-Hulse has very kindly accepted it as the substantive motion now. But I have to confess to being very confused by the Conservative amendment. They wish for a discussion on fly tipping from what Conservative members have said is very obvious. But their amendment calls for the opposite and calls for everything within the original Lib Dem motion and then the amended motion to be deleted and just refer it to scrutiny. It is a confusing amendment. It really makes very little sense, and I think we have had a very good discussion between us this evening about the difficulties of the current issues with fly tipping and litter, and we all acknowledge that there is a problem. The officers are taking great strides to improve the way that it is tackled, and particularly I'm delighted to hear prosecutions are going massively up from where they were a couple of years ago. But yeah, I think we've had, it's a good discussion, and all the better for not having the Conservative wrecking amendment deleting the discussion entirely. So thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Foster. Mr. Hughes, do I take it back to Councillor Lee to?
No, Mr. Mayor, it's Councillor Parsons-Hulse first.
Yeah, okay. Councillor Parsons-Hulse.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with with some of the Conservative points. We do have to increase the enforcement here, and I think I wasn't really that impressed by the way it was celebrated that we didn't check somebody's license and that licensed person wasn't caught. It ended up being somebody like the resident who was taken to court. I would prefer if the real criminal was caught, if that's possible, and not victimise the people. Let's face it, who checks licenses? It's not the first question you ask, is it? But anyway, yeah, I'm really excited by the fact that we are getting on with some more enforcement. And I also obviously disagree that we need to take it to place scrutiny. This has been done so many times before, and I do agree with Councillor Faisal, the educate, encourage and enforce, the 3 E's that Andrew Pitts has talked about. He came to place scrutiny. I remember that very clearly in my early days. Educate, encourage and enforce. And it's absolutely true. We need to do those things. It's also not very fair on the residents who have fly tipping dumped on their land, and the difficulties that our officers then have to go through to get that removed. It's just such a complex situation. And I do think a nice steel Councillor Fenton Glynn. Yes, you can make it about Labour if you like, but really, let's face it, we all need to work together. You know, it's such an important issue, and let's try some new things. You know, and if anything can come out of tonight, let's just agree that we're all going to work together to make Calderdale a better place without fly tipping and littering. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Councillor Parsons-House. Can I then therefore come to the amendment, Councillor Lee?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I've heard all the comments. And this isn't something that, you know, I absolutely fundamentally disagree with. I understand the point that was made by Councillor Barnes. And indeed, it's been an interesting discussion this evening with the very limited time that we've had to debate it and the very limited opportunity that everybody who is one of the 51 councillors could have in a meeting like this to robustly debate it. So I don't want any confusion here about our determination to work with all the other parties to rid our borough of this fly tipping. But I genuinely believe, and our group believes, that through a proper mechanism of a scrutiny panel with a clear directive about what's required, we can bring in all of the necessary expertise to consider all of the options that might lie on the table for Calderdale. And as Councillor Parsons has just repeated momentarily, it's a very complex problem. And if you like, you know, we're certainly not wishing to kick anything in the long grass. We're seeking to strengthen the determination by following every possible avenue to know what we're about and get this dealt with. And so that's the only reason that we didn't want to try to do it this evening, because it's more complex than that. It demands clever solutions to complex problems, and we should all be seeking to take advantage of that. So whilst I understand the resistance to our amendment on this occasion, I do stress it's with the same vested interests that we all have at heart for the borough. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lee. If there's no other comments, can I bring Councillor Swift?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be very brief because I think most of the points I would make have been made already in the debate. But just to emphasise that, apart from the general observation that undoubtedly whatever we decide this evening, this will continue to be raised with great regularity at scrutiny because everybody feels so strongly about it. You know, this motion does specifically commit to a report back to Cabinet within the next 6 months, evaluating what's currently being done and seeing what could be done there. And clearly, you know, there are a number of ways in which we could structure it so scrutiny has some input into that as well, whether by taking a draft of the report to scrutiny for kind of pre-discussion, or at worst, of course, it could also be called in. So, you know, I think the opportunity for wider debate remains there. So, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Swift. And I think we've done the moves. I am therefore now, Mr. Hughes, with your agreement, going to take it to the vote on the amendment.
Yes, that's right, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much. All in favour of the amendment, please show. All against?
That's more than, Mr. Mayor. The amendment fails.
The amendment fails. And I now go on to the motion. All in favour?
Mr. Mayor,
sorry.
You need to ask if anyone wishes to speak to the substantive motion to which we now return. It has been moved and seconded by.
Yes. Yeah. Does anybody wants to make any comments, or are we going to a vote? No indications, Mr. Hughes.
Okay, Mr. Mayor, thank you.
Thank you. Therefore, I go to the vote. All in favour?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All against?
That's less than, Mr. Mayor. The motion is carried.
Therefore, the motion is carried. Thank you very much, everybody. I will now move to the next item, which is item 17. Can I take them all in block, Mr. Hughes, or?
I think you can ask if anyone wishes to comment on any of those items, Mr. Mayor. Yes.
Yeah. Is there anybody who wishes to make comments on item 17 on the work of scrutiny boards, panels, and committees? No
I'm not seeing any
indications.
indication, Mr. Mayor.
No
No.
indications, Mr. Hughes. Therefore, we'll move on, and that probably ends the proceedings for this evening. Therefore, can I say thank you very much for everybody to attend on a second call on this occasion within this month, and I'll wish you all a good evening and safe journey back.